Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be the children of God. President Jimmy Carter ended his speech to a joint session of Congress on September 18, 1978, with this Bible quote, "And a peacemaker he was." Carter had just emerged from 13 days of intense negotiation between two historically rival nations, holed up in his own presidential retreat at Camp David, Maryland. Carter swore that he would not emerge until an agreement for peace had been signed by the two leaders that accompanied him, Egyptian President Anwar Sadat and Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin. Now, standing on the podium in the House chamber, Carter could say that because of his efforts and the compromise of the two remarkable leaders standing next to him, a peace had been achieved in the most unlikely of places, between the most unlikely of nations, in the Middle East between an Arab nation and the Jewish state. On September 17, 1978, Egyptian President Anwar Sadat and Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin signed the Camp David Accords, forever changing the trajectory of the Middle East. With the efforts and sponsorship of American President Jimmy Carter, these two leaders signed the landmark agreement, directly leading to a peace treaty between the two nations. Israel and Egypt have been at war with each other 6 separate times since Israel's founding in 1948. But due to the compromise between the leaders, for the first time, a lasting peace between an Arab nation and Israel was achieved. Menachem Begin and Anwar Sadat shared the Nobel Peace Prize for their achievement, but the accords would not be without consequences. The accords resulted in the temporary suspension of Egypt from the Arab League over outrage from other Arab nations, and in 1981, almost 3 years after signing the accords, Anwar Sadat was assassinated. However, the accords achieved peace between two nations that have never since gone to war and changed the whole nature of the Arab-Israeli conflict to that of where compromise was possible. Anwar Sadat found himself in a new position of power in 1970. His mentor and close friend, Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser, had suffered a heart attack and died, leaving Sadat as the successor to the presidency and the de facto head of the Arab world. At that time, Egypt was still reeling over the humiliation from the lopsided 1967 defeat of the Arab coalition against Israel in the Six-Day War. It was especially humiliating because it resulted in the complete Israeli takeover of the Sinai Peninsula, a highly important historical and strategic region to Egypt. Sadat wanted the Sinai back, but he also recognized that a peace with Israel would result in a subsequent strengthening of ties to the United States, a necessary relationship for Egypt's success. Sadat began to distance himself from the Soviet Union, a longtime Egyptian ally under Nasser, and instead focused on courting the United States. He is quoted as saying, "Russia can give you arms, but only the United States can give you a solution." In 1973, Sadat ordered the invasion of parts of the Sinai in an effort to reclaim it during the Yom Kippur War. He used this opportunity to establish himself as serious about reclaiming the Sinai, while at the same time expressing that he was open to negotiation with Israel in hopes of an eventual peace. Jimmy Carter also wanted peace. When he was elected in 1976, he made it one of his first goals to broker an agreement between the Arab world and Israel. "I felt that one of the reasons that I was elected was to try and bring peace to the Holy Land," he is quoted as saying. A lasting peace between the Arab world and Israel had been a long-time foreign policy goal of the U.S., but one that was always just out of reach. In Anwar Sadat, Carter saw a potential ally, an Arab leader willing to negotiate with Israel. Menachem Begin, the newly elected Israeli Prime Minister in 1977, also wanted to negotiate, creating the perfect opportunity for Carter to be the first American president to broker a lasting peace agreement in the Middle East. The efforts to get Israel and Egypt at the negotiating table together culminated when Sadat announced his intention to travel to Israel to address the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, a completely unprecedented move for an Arab leader. Soon after, Begin and the Israeli government formally invited Sadat to Israel. On November 19, 1977, Sadat laid out his vision for peace between the Arab and Israeli worlds to the Knesset, in the heart of Egypt's historical adversary. By the end of July the following year, a summit at Camp David had been agreed upon by Sadat, Begin, and Carter in order to negotiate the final resolutions of an accord between the two nations. The Camp David summit took place from September 5th to 17th, 1978, and resulted in 2 separate resolutions being agreed upon by Egypt and Israel. President Carter instructed that the entire summit be closed to the media. Carter also refused to let anyone from either the Egyptian or Israeli delegations leave before an agreement was signed. Both Begin and Sadat were aware of their counterparts' non-negotiables, things that were required for any agreement to be made. Sadat demanded complete control over the Sinai Peninsula and that all Israeli forces withdraw. Begin, on the other hand, would not yield over the issue of Palestinian autonomy in the West Bank. Begin was willing to give the Palestinians control over all civilian aspects of their government, but Israel would retain ultimate control. Begin and Sadat shared much mutual hostility, as Carter is quoted as saying, "It was mean, they were brutal with each other, personal." If not for Carter's insistence on a compromise before the summit's end, as well as his excellent skills as a mediator, the Camp David Accords might have never come to exist. Eventually, after 13 days of grueling negotiations, the two accords are agreed and signed. The first, a framework for peace in the Middle East, laid out the blueprint for a peaceful settlement in the Arab-Israeli conflict, including letting other Arab nations contribute to negotiations over the West Bank. The second accord, a framework for the conclusion of a peace treaty between Egypt and Israel, established the basis for an Israeli-Egyptian peace treaty predicated on Israeli withdrawal from the Sinai Peninsula. It called for a formal peace treaty to be signed 6 months later, and on March 26, 1979, Menachem Begin and Anwar Sadat did just that, cementing the new peace on the White House lawn. Both these accords would permanently alter the Arab-Israeli conflict and the trajectory of the Middle East. The impacts of the Camp David Accords were felt immediately across the Arab world. Numerous Arab nations felt outraged and betrayed that Sadat, who many Arabs once considered a hero for his actions during the Yom Kippur War, had made peace with their sworn enemy. The concessions Egypt made in the Accords over the autonomy of the West Bank were perceived by many Arabs as abandoning the cause of the Palestinians. Sadat had hoped that Arab nations, especially Jordan, would join him in accepting the Accords, but instead opposition only grew, and Egypt was suspended from the Arab League in 1979, only being readmitted 10 years later. And even though Sadat remained relatively popular in Egypt, opposition to Sadat culminated on October 6, 1981, when Islamic jihadists, angry over the peace with Israel, assassinated Sadat during an Egyptian military parade. However, the long-term impact of the Accords revealed that they established more peace than turmoil. By signing the Accords, Egypt, the most powerful Arab nation, essentially withdrew itself from the Arab-Israeli conflict. This created a power vacuum, but it also opened the door to more peaceful relations between Arab nations and Israel. Not only have the Accords had the obvious effect of ending the Israeli-Egyptian wars, but they have helped to encourage other Arab nations to end the conflict as well. Without Egypt's military might, Arab-Israeli wars after 1978 have been fewer and more subdued compared to the 30 years of near constant turmoil preceding. Egypt became the first Arab nation to formally recognize Israel as a legitimate state, creating a climate where other Arab nations could do the same. At the Madrid Conference in 1991, Arab leaders from Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon met with Israeli leaders, ending over 40 years of refusal to negotiate face-to-face with Israel. In 1994, Israel and Jordan signed their own peace treaty. Neither of those breakthroughs would have been possible without Egypt first opening the door to dialogue between the Arab world and Israel. The Camp David Accords have acted as a model for American foreign policy, for Arab-Israeli relations, and ultimately for how peace can be achieved in one of the most volatile regions in the world. Though the Accords left many sides dissatisfied, they continue to be the shining example of successful compromise in the ongoing Arab-Israeli conflict.